word terrorist, who do you picture? Chances are it's not a white person. This image most likely represents who most people would think of. We have seen movies, television shows, and heard news with narratives about terrorists, and have a clear picture and stereotype of who they are. But what if I told you that white supremacy is the FBI's largest identified domestic terrorist threat and has been for years? Would you freak out, call them names, kill them, or treat them any differently? The answer is most likely no. Why is that? Well, I'm here to tell you why. We need to treat white supremacy, threats of terrorism like a five-alarm fire, just like we would with any group other than white. So the topics I will include are the reaction society has had towards previous terrorist attacks, racial inequalities when it comes to terrorism, and the stereotypes society puts on Islamic terrorists versus white supremacists. The first topic I will cover is the reaction society has had towards previous terrorist attacks. One of the most well-known terrorist attacks we remember was on September 11, 2001. President George W. Bush announced a comprehensive plan to seek out and stop terrorists around the world after 9/11, and this came from George W. Bush Library. The quote-unquote global war on terror term was also used to describe diplomatic, financial, and other actions taken to deny financing or safe harbor for terrorists. The initial strikes the U.S. took were against al-Qaeda, terrorist training camps, and Taliban military installations. Shock, sadness, fear, and anger filled the air, and this attack reshaped the global response on terrorism. Many of you also probably remember what happened on January 6, 2021. Mind you, the definition of terrorism is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. Donald Trump supporters attacked the U.S. Capitol building in order to overturn the valid results of the 2020 presidential election by interrupting the U.S. Congress's count of electoral votes that would certify the election. People remained fearless after this attack, yet when 9/11 happened, people were running around in fear and shock. How does that happen? Congress.gov stated, several others tragically lost their lives during the domestic terrorism attack on our nation, incited by the former president and his enablers seeking to overturn the results of the legitimate election. Notice the differences between how society reacted? The next topic I will address is the racial inequalities when it comes to terrorism. First, I will talk about attacks by non-whites, and this information comes from govinfo.gov. The December 2nd, 2015 attack on the Inland Regional Center in San Bernardino County that killed 14 people was considered domestic terrorism, but the perpetrators were non-white Muslims. The June 12, 2016 mass shooting at Pulse nightclub in Florida that killed 49 people was considered domestic terrorism, and the perpetrator was also a non-white Muslim. But the deadly white supremacist attacks and mass shootings at the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, where 9 people were killed, or at the Tree of Life Synagogue, where 11 people were killed, was not called domestic terrorism, and the perpetrators were white males. The deadly violence that took place at Charlottesville, where 3 people were killed and 35 were injured, was not called domestic terrorism, but the perpetrator was a white male. But here are the true statistics of the number of fatalities from both groups. Congress.gov states, fatalities resulting from attacks by far right-wing violent extremists or white supremacists have exceeded those caused by radical Islamic violent extremists in 10 of the 15 years, and were the same in 3 of the years since September 12, 2001. Of the 85 violent extremist incidents that resulted in death since September 12, 2001, far right-wing violent extremist groups were responsible for 62, or 73%, while radical Islamic violent extremists were responsible for 23, or 27%. The last topic I'm going to cover are the stereotypes put on Islamic terrorists versus white supremacists. One of the main myths you'll probably hear is terrorists are always brown or Muslims. And all of the information I'm about to say comes from Fordham Law Review. Terrorists are always Muslims jeopardizes the security of Americans who are Muslims or who are perceived as Muslims, causing them to fear for their life and feel unsafe. The next myth we probably have heard is white people are never terrorists. This belief results in security blind spots that make the United States less safe. In reality, white privilege helps whites avoid the terrorist label. Attacks caused by whites are normally called hate crimes or political arguments instead, which shows this privilege because they get treated like people who don't know better when they do, just like any other person knows right from wrong. And also, another thing that does not help with this is that the news normally links Muslim with the word terrorism, which causes us to believe that it's always Muslims. In summary, the world does not treat white supremacists as terrorists due to past reactions to terrorist attacks, racial inequalities when it comes to terrorism, and stereotypes put on Islamic terrorists versus white supremacists. So the next time you're tempted to disregard white supremacist attacks, ask yourself how you would react if they were anyone other than white and fix your mindset. I ask you to address yourself or those who have certain beliefs towards foreign terrorists and look at the real facts. People being so closed-minded is the reason why the world is suffering to grow and become better. So let's make the world better. Racism is already a problem in this world, so there's no need to let white supremacists get away with killing people because a normal terrorist is not white. Do your part to stop racism and stereotypes because anyone inflicting harm or violence in this world needs to be treated exactly the same, especially when they kill based off of other people not agreeing with their views or being a certain race, sexual orientation, gender, etc. Racism is ignorance, therefore, fuck racism and anyone who goes along with it. Thank you. Pardon my language. I was really feeling that one.
Go for it. Sometimes that's the word you need.
Any questions?
Very powerful.
Yes.
So there's no doubt that the mainstream media obviously has painted this picture. How do we change this now? Because it's obvious that like Islamic Muslim people have been painted as terrorists. It's clear. It happened in Canada too. It happens all over really North America. How do we change this now to get this information out there? Because the majority of people, if you watch the news, you watch all these things, have no idea what you just spoke about.
Honestly, I think it just needs to be talked about, and we need to stop putting out articles that make it seem like these white supremacist attacks are not terrorism. I mean, by us linking Muslim with terrorists, we're putting that in our heads that that's what they are.
Yeah.
But if we put white supremacist does this hate crime, or they did an attack on the US Capitol building, but they do not mention anything about terrorism whatsoever. I read, I think it was in Charlottesville, where a white supremacist had blew up an entire, like it was an entire building, but it wasn't as big as 9/11. But that's still, they did not put terrorism in that article. So like, we just need to add that word, because if we're not adding that, people fear that word, terrorism. They fear the word bombing. They fear anything like that, because when 9/11 happened, everyone was running around in shock and fear. So if we don't make people fearful of these things, they're gonna keep walking around like, you know, white supremacists, you know, are not terrorists, because we don't link that word with white supremacists. So it's really just, we have to change how the news, you know, puts it out there before we can change the mindsets of the people, because if we don't link those words, we're never gonna get it in our head, you know, because they keep linking it with other things. So yeah. Yes.
So, going based off that, do you think they should start teaching it in schools, like trying to like show that? Because I know in my school we talked a little bit about terrorism, but like I know the only thing that they focused on was like every terroristic attack they showed us, it was just Muslim people, not like no other race. And I was like, this is, cause like I'm like that's kind of odd.
A little racist.
Like I'm
Yeah.
just a little, cause I'm just like I'm pretty sure there are a lot more attacks that have been caused pretty much a lot by more not like white people than Muslim people. So do you think they should start teaching that in schools?
I definitely think they do. And I feel like a lot of schools tend to pick and choose what they want to teach. So like, you know, Lindbergh, just like we said the other day, I mean, some schools were taught about redlining, I think it was, and then some schools weren't. You know, like some schools tend to pick their own curriculum, but it's like a lot of them base it off of the history books and what's common in the history books. And in the history books, do we really hear about white supremacist attacks? Barely, and if they do, then they probably just go over it and they go straight to 9/11, or
They
they go
tend to be
to,
glorified.
yeah. And I've heard about, you know, Al Qaeda, and I've heard about, I forgot the other freaking name, Taliban, all that stuff. It's like, yeah, we've heard of the KKK, but people make jokes about the KKK. You know, they're like, you know, he's a part of the KKK, because if you see a racist person, you most likely say that as a joke, but shouldn't we fear them? Oh, luckily it was not my other ringtone, because that would have not been good. But yeah, I really just think we do need to start teaching it in schools, and we shouldn't, you know, mainly focus on, like, we shouldn't keep focusing on just 9/11, because the fact that that's the most well-known thing, and that's mostly what we just talk about and what we think of as the biggest terrorist attack, it makes us view that we were so scared and, oh, this was a terrible event, which it was, but we don't talk about all the other terrible events that have happened. So I feel like we need to incorporate both sides instead of just sticking to one.
But I feel like once
Great
kids
job.
get to understand that, they can actually like start perceiving other things.
Thank you so much.